Hey, before we get into the episode, I've got a question for you. Do you like free plugins? Because if so, check this out. So I just released two brand new plugins under my plugin company, Carb Audio, and I want to make sure that you know about them because they were both built to solve a problem that I see happening all the time. And that is the need for long, overcomplicated signal chains just to get the sound right. The first plugin is called Busboy, and it was built for the mix bus and instrument buses, and it's designed to give you polish, glue, and control, but without having to build a big chain. It combines broad musical shelving EQ inspired by a $10,000 mastering EQ, along with classic bus compression and limiting that helps to glue a mix together and help you get punch. And here's the important part that you're going to want to know. Busboy is completely free right now until March 2nd, so definitely make sure to check it out. The second plugin is called Slapshot, and it's all about adding width and depth, but without the muddiness that usually comes along with reverbs and delays. And it is built around a slap delay approach that I've personally used on vocals for pretty much every mix that I've done over the last 15 years. But the beauty of this plugin is that all of the cleanup is handled behind the scenes, which makes it super easy for you to dial in a sound that sounds nice and clean. And for a limited time, Slapshot is going to have introductory pricing of only $9, so it's super affordable. So if you want to make clearer mixes with fewer plugins, you can grab them both right now at carbaudio.com. And again, Busboy is free until March 2nd, and Slapshot has super low introductory pricing. All right, that said, let's get into the episode. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Navina, and thank you for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Ryan Ellery, and Ryan is a recording and mixing engineer based out of California. She works out of Sharkbite Studios and has worked with artists such as Mom Jeans, Just Friends, Graduating Life, Snooze, and a whole bunch more, primarily working in the punk, indie, hardcore kind of scene. And in today's episode, we talk a lot about the idea of creating comfort in the studio and what that looks like as far as making sure that everyone's on the same page, but also making sure that everyone's getting the experience they entered the studio expecting. You know, a lot of artists have been in the studio before. They've experienced recording a specific way. They may have liked that way. They may have hated it. And so your job as an engineer is to ultimately help the band get their vision to come to life, but ultimately create an experience that they're going to look back fondly on. You know, you want these people to come back to you if you're making this a career, if you're, making your living off of having bands come through the door. You don't want to have bands come in, give them an awful experience, and then they disappear and they go to someone else afterwards, right? We want to give them an experience that they're going to be happy with, and that, the time in the studio was great. The sound that they got in the end was really good. And so all of that has to do with setting expectations early, having great lines of communication. And this is something that Ryan really emphasizes throughout this episode. And it's something that she's built into her process, making sure that she's taking care of a lot of these big questions early on. And these questions are going to determine a lot of the things, such as how they're going to track. Are they going to track live off the floor? Are they going to track everyone individually? Are they going to include a lot of effects and saturation and stuff like that during the tracking stage, or is that going to be dealt with after the fact? There's a lot of things that you need to establish before you even start. So by getting all of these conversations out of the way and get everyone on the same page right away, that is just going to help make the entire experience that much better. And another thing that Ryan brings up in this interview is this idea of the performance being more important than the mix itself. I actually agree with that wholeheartedly. If you have crappy performances and you have crappy recordings, no amount of mixing is going to fix that, right? So a lot of what we're talking about here as far as creating comfort, that results in better performances, which allows your mixes to sound better, which then gets the final product to sound better. It makes every band feel like they have their own unique sound and they present themselves in a way that is different and not a cookie cutter approach or cookie cutter sound. So yeah, this is a great interview. I think you're going to really enjoy this one. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Ryan Ellery, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going today?
It's going good. Yeah. Despite starting to feel under the weather a little bit. Yeah, it feels, or today's been nice so far.
I feel like I'm starting to get it too, and it's just that time of year. But thank you for making the time to come on. For people who might not be familiar with you, can you tell us who you are, what you do, and kind of how you got into this stuff?
Yeah, so I am a recording engineer based in Oakland, California, and I've been professionally recording, I think it must be around 11 years now. I remember kind of pinpointing the 10-year mark of when I first started recording in a studio with clients that were paying and stuff like that. But I got into recording at a pretty young age out of just by way of playing music growing up. And I was a guitar player. I still am a guitar player. And my brother is a drummer. And growing up, we would play music together. And I had this kind of desire to want to like capture it. So that was like my like kind of earliest intro into recording. But there was kind of a large gap between that practice and then what developed into being my career and everything like that as a recording engineer. But definitely things were kind of born out of this desire to want to be able to hear music that I was playing, just to be able to like have it and be able to listen to it afterwards and things like that. So it started from that kind of very basic desire. And then over time, it developed into like more of a specific kind of interest in getting things to like sound better. And then I wasn't even aware that it was like a job. Like when I was in high school and stuff like that, I was like, did not know what I wanted to do as far as career goes. And I came from like a suburb that was very career and college driven. And I was like a punk kid who just only understood playing music. And that was like all I could navigate successfully. So I was kind of at a loss as what to do. But it was my dad actually who told me like, you can record people as a job. That is a job. And I had no idea. And I was like a junior in high school. So at that time, I started going to community college classes to learn Pro Tools and other DAWs while I was like a junior. And then like as a senior as well, I was doing like night classes and stuff. And it was like the first time that like being in a class environment was engaging for me. And that was where I like actually learned. I didn't know about like inserting plugins on channels at all. I was using Audio Suite in Pro Tools for everything before that. Like it really opened my mind up to like the things you could do with recording. And I was approaching it like so basically. So yeah, that was when I started to really like kind of pursue the idea of getting good at it as a skill and not just for myself. And I would record some bands in my area. There wasn't a lot going on musically in the particular city that I lived in, which is Lafayette, California. So there wasn't a ton of people to work with, but I would take any opportunity I could with the gear that I had at home to work with people. And after that, I finished what the community college offered, which was pretty much just like a Pro Tools 101 and then like a multi-track recording class and things like that. And after that, I was at like a crossroads a bit with whether to go to a like, I guess, yeah, like one of those like specialized recording schools that just like teach you studio work and stuff like that. But those were incredibly expensive. And I figured it'd be best if I just tried to kind of navigate it on my own rather than go into like a schooling environment that I would have to take out a bunch of loans for to do. And so instead, I just tasked myself with being like an engineer and trying to navigate things on my own. But through that is how I ended up interning at a studio and then eventually being the other staff engineer at that studio. And I think that is like the kind of inception point of all of this stuff really clicking. And that's how it was explained to me a lot too, was that like once you get in somewhere, like if you maintain that and hold on to it, you can like ride that out. So that was when I was like 20. I finally like was working at a studio and it was like a total dream come true. It was like the only like tangible like aspiration I really had for my life is like if I can just be a professional recording engineer recording bands, then like I've like made it kind of thing. So that's when that started, and that was about like 10 or 11 years ago.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, there's lots that we can cover from what you just said there, and I think one of the great things to maybe touch on is just that idea of like I love that you mentioned that prior to like going to this community college, you were using Audio Suite for everything, and like kind of just like you had your own workflow, and then you figured out this better way of doing it just by shadowing other people. And you know, I think that really highlights that idea of just like sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and like you just have to be in the room with other people, learn from them. And like, there's a lot that you can take from that. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to pick up on. Were there any other kind of like eye-opening moments that you had during that time of like, oh shoot, like I can make my process so much better if I did this?
Yeah, during that time, I mean, I feel like that's when I really grasped like an understanding of what like audio workflow was. And because it was all a mystery to me. I didn't know how preamps like interfaced with equipment because I was using so many like kind of like built-in preamps inside of DAWs. Like outboard gear was really mystifying to me. So like it was all that was all like kind of its own one major epiphany that like Pro Tools was this like very comprehensive tool because I was basically using it as like a tape recorder almost. Like it was just the channels were going in and that's what they sounded like, and then I would hit bounce at the end of the session. So as far as like those kind of epiphanies go, it's like a lot more of like like setting up an aux channel to send reverb to, and like it blew my mind that when you like muted the main track, you would still hear the reverb and stuff like that. So yeah, I was just very early on into the whole thing. A lot more of the kind of when I was working at the first studio I worked at and watching the engineer there. And it's just a barrage of workflow moves, like key commands, all this stuff. And it's just when you haven't developed any of that stuff on your own, it really like changes your whole view of everything and how you could approach things. But as far as specifics go, it's hard to like recall exact ones. It's more like I just remember the feeling of seeing things and being like, I want to try that. And I would get so immersed in trying it myself and doing all those things. And it's just such a like condensed way of learning something as opposed to like kind of trying to arrive at it on your own or read about it or something like that. Like seeing it happen in front of you is just like, you get like years of experience just from internalizing that from somebody else.
For sure. But I think that like just even those couple points you brought up there of like learning key commands or learning routing, like those are things that, yeah, if you don't know about them, you're not going to ever start to dig into it. Right. And so I think it is fun to just kind of like sometimes remember some of these things that in those early days, we kind of didn't know, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this podcast that are thinking like, oh, I don't know about key commands. I don't know about routing. So, for those people that are listening, like start doing some research, like that's kind of why we do this podcast, right? It's just like to learn these little things that maybe we don't know and pick up on different workflow tips and stuff like that. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool to identify that in your own journey there. Then as far as like, so you got a job working at a studio, was the goal to just like be a permanent staff member at a studio, or were you hoping to go out and be a freelance engineer and do your own thing, or maybe even open up your own studio at some point? If you're a fan of the Master Your Mix podcast, you might not even know yet that we actually have a full website packed with a ton of resources designed to help you make better mixes. So head on over to MasterYourMix.com, and on there you're going to find free downloads, cheat sheets, blog articles, books, courses, and a whole bunch more, all designed to help simplify your mixing process, give you more clarity, and help you finish more music without second-guessing every move. And then, if you're looking for more personalized one-on-one help, where I can work directly with you on your tracks and walk you through the recording, editing, and mixing processes step by step, that's exactly what I work on inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And you can learn more about that at masteryourmix.com/amplitude. And on that page, you can book a free call with me where we can talk through your current process, figure out where your gaps are, and identify the fastest ways to help you move forward with your tracks. And then if it makes sense to work together beyond that call, we can absolutely talk about that too. So once again, that's masteryourmix.com. And then for coaching, masteryourmix.com/amplitude.
I think throughout my time with doing this stuff, I've been in different places with that where initially, and the thing about the studio I ended up working at was like, I had a particular interest in working in that studio because it was somewhat local, and one of the bands that I really enjoyed at the time when I started getting into recording, it's this band called Sabretooth Zombie. They're from like the North Bay area. I knew that they recorded at this studio called Panda that was in Fremont. The Panda Studios is like the name of it. And
Sam Pura studio, right?
Yeah. That's the first studio I worked at. And that band was really important to me. And so that was like my only really, like, I didn't know a lot of other like engineers. I wasn't tapped in. And I think also that time was like a bit different. I think people are very like recording engineer aware nowadays, more so than like back then. I'm sure people who like are really into music back then as well kind of were up on that. But like it was the one place I could point to and be like, okay, like if I could work anywhere, I want to work at this place. So I was following them on social media and stuff like that. And that's how I initially started interning there. But the funny thing about that is that Sabretooth Zombie's like a thrash, punk, hardcore, sludgy band that's like rough around the edges. And that's the kind of music I'm really into. And I didn't realize that was like an anomaly in Sam Pura's catalog. And when I got there, then I like started to realize like, oh, this is like a pop punk studio. And Sabretooth Zombie is like an outlier in the catalog. I had never heard of like The Story So Far or anything like that because I was like just into like more of like the kind of like punk stuff going on at that time. So it was an interesting like adjustment because I dedicated myself so much to like interning at first and being down there as much as possible. And then when one of their engineers left, I was the most like suited person to take over that role because I had been there so much at that time and I was assisting Sam directly so much. So I assumed the role as the engineer in the kind of other studio because it's like a 2-studio complex. But then like the clientele I was working with was all like pop punk bands, which has, well, not just all pop punk bands, but bands that are like seeking out that kind of production on their records. And the workflow for that is like very particular. It can be very meticulous. And so learning how to make records that way was very beneficial for understanding like editing and quantizing and all that stuff, which is not somewhere I would like naturally have led myself to go, but to fit the role and do what I had to do to work with like those kind of clients, that's like what I did. So yeah, I mean, early on, that was like my goal was to be at that studio. But through time of being there, I found myself not liking that workflow very much. The very like granular and the oversight and the really like altering things with a performance and all that. There's times where it works out well. There's times when it's like very arduous and it's stressful environment doing that. And I found myself feeling more and more disconnected from doing work in that way. And I initially thought that like maybe this like whole career is like not for me because that was my only like kind of foot in the door at the time. So I grappled with that a lot. But then in that sort of feeling really dismayed by things, I explored other options or like explored other like kind of practices and stuff. And I, in that time, got really into like Steve Albini's production and things like that. And I was learning more about how there's this whole other way of doing audio. And that resonated with me a lot more because I'm not the kind of person who asserts herself as like an authority on how people make art. I take a lot of cues from the artists who are entrusting me with the work. So when I realized that was more of a possibility, I got a lot more inspired by doing things in that way. But that wasn't compatible necessarily with how Panda did their work. Yep. And so I knew that I would have to be my own like person to be able to do that and be able to conduct sessions in the way that I wanted to. So I worked at Panda for like 2 years, but then after that I went freelance and I was living like in the East Bay at that time, not in Fremont. And then I got in touch with Sharkbite Studios in Jack London area of Oakland. And I've been there now for, I guess, yeah, I've been recording professionally for 12 years because I've been at Sharkbite now for 10 and I was at Panda for 2. So yeah, I went on my own to do it.
Very cool.
And that's what I've been doing since.
Nice. I mean, I think that's really, it's a cool story to hear that. And I think it's important because there are so many different ways to learn this stuff. And yeah, when you shadow someone, you're going to learn their process. And if you feel like that is the way you want to make music, then by all means, like take that process on and make it yours. But I love that kind of, you were able to identify that this isn't the kind of stuff that I want to work on. So I need to find this other way. Like, I think that's actually really admirable. It's very cool that you kind of went the complete opposite direction with the Albini approach. Mm-hmm. And I was curious to actually learn a little bit about that because I know that on your website, you do mention that you're pretty open-minded to working with clients like the way that they want to work. And, and you do give that example on your website about the live off the floor versus kind of tracking everything individually kind of example. So it sounds like your personal preference is to do more of like the live off the floor or something a little bit more gritty. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I would say that is... A lot of times I feel like that approach is going to suit what the music that I'm working with is for the most part, unless because I've had bands still come through with me that like do the multi-track stuff, do like the kind of very like segmented style of recording, but their music lends itself to that. And then as musicians, they're like primed to record in that way. So in that case, it's like totally natural and doesn't impose any sort of strain on the artist to do that. Like I've had drummers that go in and just listen to just the click track, no other instruments, lay down the takes perfectly, and then we build everything on top of it. And so like I think it's just depending on like the person that's coming to me, but I think where at least I would get into difficult situations was a band that is not suited for recording that way, but then making them do that because that's like a way to get a very replicatable result, or just kind of like assume that that is going to complement what they're doing. And then you're putting them in a position where they're tracking in a way that's completely disconnected from how they're used to playing music. And I think the performance will suffer from that sometimes. And then I think sometimes their general sentiment around what they're doing is going to be taxed in some way as well. So it's not always that just like capturing things as natural and raw is like the best way to do things. But I think if a lot of bands are used to performing their music all together in a room without kind of deconstructing it in this like kind of sterilized studio environment, I've found a lot of success with accommodating that as much as possible. And
That's
just
very cool.
seeing how people like respond to that just in their whole like presence in the studio has been what's encouraged me to like be able to accommodate that sort of workflow.
For sure. And that's very cool that you've at least now learned both sides of it, so you can make that adjustment on the fly if you need to. How do you generally decide like which approach is going to serve a project the best way in terms of like their vision or their energy? Is it, I mean, if you have a band that's never been in the studio before, they don't always know what the best way to track is, right? So how do you determine and make that call when it is better to go with that kind of individual tracking approach versus the live off the floor kind of thing?
I think it comes down to having a lot of good communication ahead of time. And I try to do my best to explain the pros and cons of each tracking, or at least the considerations for each of them. And from doing it as long as I have been, I think, relay that sort of stuff to them in a way that helps them make an informed decision. And I prioritize like I mean, a lot of times it's like a time constraint, like how long is the session? Because we could go about things in a tedious way if we have this plethora of time. But if we're like trying to do 10 songs in a weekend, that, you know,
It's not going to happen.
it's best to be time conscious. Yeah. I mean, some people can do it. And I think I'm pretty good at like sussing out like who can really crush it and who might need to take some time. So I think with so many things, it comes down to communicating it to the band and dispelling any sort of idea that, or like preconceived notion they have that this way will be better or this way will get us like this sound. And except when those things are like factually like true, but like offering approaches and explaining the pros and cons to them. And I think you know, bands know themselves like well enough, and like they know what is going to feel good. And I think prioritizing that, especially for people who don't have a lot of studio experience, is really good, because you can put somebody off of recording by just like torturing them on their first record. And I've had a lot of people. Yeah, I've had so many people that have worked with me that have like said like, you know, like I hate recording. Like I just like it makes me feel anxious, and like the studio just like zaps all my energy and stuff. And I try to provide those people with like an experience that can kind of be corrective in that sense. And yeah, I think a lot of that comes from people just they get so wrapped up in the technical and like their role and like their kind of catalog that they completely overlook the artist. It seems like that happens to people. And I think if you just develop that communication and that trust with the people that you work with, it just benefits the whole process so much, because it's people making art at the end of the day. So if you take them out of their element with it, the whole thing's going to be obscured from its initial intention.
For sure. No, I love that. I can totally relate to what you just said there of like, I can't tell you how many times I've been in the studio with a band that's been in the studio before, and they were like, "Oh man, the last time we were there, we hated it. You know, like it just like made us
Mhm.
not want to record." And like, and then you just quickly have to adapt to that, and you're just like, "Okay, what didn't you like? How do we make this experience better?" And just
Yeah,
those lines of communication go a real long way, just to make sure that you get the result you're looking for, but also you win a client for life kind of thing. So it goes a long way.
totally. Yeah, and you can develop with them too, is the thing. Like as they get more comfortable in the studio, they can be more ambitious and stuff like that. And like you can maybe achieve these more grandiose kind of ideas. But I think if you just bombard a band with like this stressful recording environment, like it can tank a band. I've seen recordings just like obliterate bands' chemistry and just they never release something again. And I mean, sometimes that's meant to be, and then sometimes I feel like if it went about in a different way, people would be more inspired and encouraged to keep creating. So I try to just like not be anybody's like worst experience in the studio.
For
That's like
sure.
my number one goal.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good rule. You want to avoid being the worst experience for a band.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So what other things aside from like the tracking process are you communicating about with artists before they get into the studio? Like how are you guys getting aligned as far as the vision that you're seeking out to achieve, and kind of turning that into like concrete like recording ideas, or like a process for that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it ranges. It's like on a spectrum for sure because I have been fortunate enough to work with like genres that or artists that fall under a lot of different genres. And the genre will kind of influence the questions that I ask and the approaches that I'll propose to them. So for like things that are like on a more kind of hardcore and punk level, there is a concern usually a lot for like an audio aesthetic because it can range from like kind of more tight production, and then there's people that really like the embellishments of less favorable like recording mediums like 4-track cassettes and stuff like that, and kind of finding out where the band lies on their like kind of vision for their music, and then proposing the different ways to like work with it. A lot of times, like for a while now, I've been recording either in my rehearsal space that is in the same building as the professional recording studio that I work at, Sharkbite. I'll pitch like, like, is this the kind of thing where y'all want to be all in one small room together? Like amps are feeding back the whole time, just like crushing the tracks live kind of thing? Or like, do you want to be able to take your time and have more sonic flexibility? Should we move it over into the other studio, put the cabs in isolation rooms? So yeah, even within that genre of like kind of heavier music, there's those considerations. So, and then yeah, it's just kind of like seeing where they are at with like playing together or separating it out, having the ability to punch in things later, doing vocals live with the band, being on headphones, being not on headphones. Lately I've been on a kick of like seeing if I can just like not have anybody on headphones even at the actual like professional studio, because I've just seen people operate in such a more comfortable way by being able to do that. So
Interesting.
yeah, and I also like I try to like work diligently and quickly and like have my stuff figured out in such a way that like we have some time, even if the session is like not a very long session, we have some time to like try something out, and if that doesn't work, we scrap it and we can do a different approach. So I try and let the band really like feel comfortable that they can like determine the best way to work, and then we can start really working on it, as opposed to like having to make the decision at the beginning of the day, and then if it's not working, you're stuck with it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And like something as simple as like being on headphones or not on headphones, you can figure that out pretty quick if it's not going to work. So it's if you have this gut instinct that is the right move, it's worth a shot. And then yeah, if it sucks, then you learn it in a matter of minutes, as opposed to like spending a whole session and realizing after the fact that everyone hated it, right? So
Well, another thing too is like I think giving them the agency over their process, because I think a lot of people will come into the studio and assume that I am like the final authority on everything, and if just because I'm setting things up in a certain way, they have to go along with it in that way. And I really try and like strike the balance between like artists having confidence in in what I'm doing, but not defaulting to my approach over what might feel better for them. So, because I think that can be like a tricky line where people want to entrust the person in charge of their, like, the service that they're getting with that kind of like putting that sort of authority on them. But I don't want that to lead to somebody being uncomfortable and then not feeling comfortable enough to voice it because they just put it on themselves that they're like, oh, I must be like just not suited to understand this stuff if I'm like having a hard time doing something. And yeah, so things like that, like I think giving them a lot of autonomy and agency over what they're doing helps a lot with arriving at those things.
Absolutely. Like, I think that, I mean, everything you're saying here is really helping to piece together kind of something that I thought before we got on our call today, which is that, like, when I was listening to your portfolio, like, one of the things that really stood out to me was the fact that all of the songs that I heard in there really, like, each band has its own personality. It has its own sound. It's very unique. It sounds like you don't really rely a lot on like drum samples or like even consistent sounds, you know? So like that in itself is just, it's really cool because it gives everyone that you work with a unique flavor, and it really doesn't pigeonhole you into like being known for a specific sound either. So I think a lot of that has to do with just exactly what you're talking about here, and just like letting it be up to the band to figure out what's going to get their excitement levels up and ultimately get their vision to come out too, right?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's two schools of thought around it. And there's some people that do like hone in on a specific sound and become very good at that. I think there's a lot of benefits to that. But I definitely realized with myself that I wanted to be available to like an array of different music and not just kind of develop the laser focused like workflow. And so the sounds you hear from the bands oftentimes, I think what I pride myself on is that people will come to me and be like, I want it to sound like this. And they'll give me like a collection of like reference points of what they want. And I have tried to build up the skill of being able to take all those points of reference and embrace that along with what the band just does naturally. And then I think that's how you get this like dialectic of a unique product at the end of it. So yeah, I'm glad that it comes across that way listening to the stuff that I've worked on, that it isn't a particular sound. If anything, it's like a particular fluidity to how things are captured.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, definitely like that live feel was one of the things that really stood out to me. And I felt like, you know, I would hear a lot of like ambience and room tone and stuff like that in the recordings that you work on. And to me, that kind of just adds to some of the chaos, especially for like the heavier stuff. Just on that note, just as far as like room sounds go, like how much are you capturing the rooms as you're recording? Like, are you doing it on pretty much everything, or just drums, or is it kind of just when the band's playing live, you just have a couple of room mics up? Like, what's that look like there?
There's times when I get really nerdy about it, for sure. Especially like it starts with at the drums. If I'm at like the studio with the bigger live room and everything, for a long time, I just recently sold this mic because I couldn't justify having it anymore because I could make do with others. But I had like this Royer SF24V. It's like their stereo tube microphone. That thing was awesome. And I would put that in front of drums to capture, like I really would like, sometimes I would even put on headphones and like crank it and like move around until I felt like I was standing in front of the drum kit. And like that was like my kind of like initial ambience, was like, what does it sound like if you're just right in front of these drums? And then throughout my time doing this, there was a point in time where I was very like room mics on the floor kind of person. Like I would tape my AKG 414s in Omni in a 6-foot like equilateral triangle from the kick drum. And then later on, I got into throwing room mics up in the corners of the studio on like really high boom stands. And from that point, if I was doing guitars in the live room, I would keep those room mics like recording for the guitars as well. Or I would move like one guitar take to like the left side of the room and one to the right, and trying to like kind of create this sense that like even if things are multi-tracked or like redone after like the initial take or something like that, on a psychoacoustics level, your ears perceive it as like this is all happening in the same space. And I really enjoy what that does for like a mix and stuff like that. Because I found my mixes that feel disconnected from like what a band is doing is usually lacking in like kind of an ambience that would convey to your ears that you are like perceiving all of this music happening in one space. So yeah, they play a big role, just mics and omnis spaced out in a room. And for the stuff I do in my rehearsal space, it's like I don't do any room mics for that because there's no room to mic. They're just all in there together and it happens naturally. But yeah, I think that sort of stuff is like an important thing to kind of hone in on and not just kind of like throw up some mic that is crushed somewhere. I mean, that can have a cool effect, but I think like approaching ambience in a, I don't want to say scientific because I think that's giving myself too much credit, but like in an intentional sort of way to convey a certain kind of intimacy goes a long way in music in general.
For sure. How often do you find yourself using like room simulation plugins, like an Ocean Way or Sound City kind of plugin or something like that?
Yeah, I find myself doing that quite a bit, especially if I've recorded in my rehearsal space and I want even more embellishment on that sort of front. I use like it's Pro R, like Pro Q. What is Fab Filter?
Fab Filter, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I swear I normally know this. I'm just used to like just punching that in on my when I'm searching for the plugin, but I'll just use those. I've been curious about like if I have like a Brightcasty or something like that. That would be amazing. But I've just never felt so impassioned by that I would drop that kind of money on it. But yeah, I definitely like, I will do what I can to achieve it in any sort of way if I wasn't able to in the room, or if I felt like I could have done more. Or if the band is kind of like saying like, oh, it'd be cool if these, you know, the toms had like this kind of sound. It's like the only way I'm going to get that is to like throw a plugin on. But I get excited to be like, oh yeah, let me achieve that kind of idea. So yeah, it's a combination of what I either can do during tracking or like what I can do in post to achieve that sort of goal. And I find that those things are successful, like sending toms and overheads to a room reverb, or like just the snare to a room reverb, like can do a lot. So I definitely keep that in like my options for how to achieve it.
For sure. I love that. Well, another thing I'd mentioned earlier was that idea of drum samples. And it seems like, I mean, to my ear, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of drum samples in your mixes. And I'm curious, maybe I'm completely wrong about that, but number one, are samples something you use a lot? And if so, like when do you find yourself gravitating towards them?
They are for specific things. Like I don't have any qualms with like knowing when something is going to need them, and I'll implement them in that case, especially with like bands that just like that is like the sound they're going for. If it's like this kind of like new metal thing, or certain kinds of hardcore music benefit from like that sort of like insane kick and snare like impact. So if it sounds good when I do it, and it kind of it contextualizes the music in the right way, then that's when I'll like reach for it. But I'm glad to hear that it doesn't sound like I use them too much, because I really do. I layer them in with the kick and snare that's naturally there. I try and like really make it seem like they're not this like stark addition on top of things. Like I really try and like make it a convincing part of it.
Yeah, it never sounded to me like the samples were the star of the performance. You know, like they all, if they were there, it was hard to tell because you'd lean so much on like the real sound.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I'm glad, because I mean, like I think some stuff just benefits from being like 100% wet sample. Like take the kick out. I worked on a death metal record recently where it's like that kick is, I just high passed like everything to get the original kick out, and like we're just rocking with the sample, but like that's that kind of music. So it made sense too. And then a lot of times when I get projects to mix from people like sent in to me, I find myself like reaching for that. I think also because like, especially if they're recorded like on their own and it's like not the most favorable environment for recording drums, I kind of see that as a way to be like, well, let me give these drums like the studio sound they could have had if that's where you guys recorded at. And I think that's like sometimes what people are like seeking out when they reach out for me to mix. So that'll be a time that like I definitely like implement them, and it does feel like it elevates things a bit. And it's no shade on like the person who drummed on the record usually a lot of the time too. It's just like,
for sure,
if you recorded this in your, you know, garage or something, I going to do some things to kind of at least make it feel a little bit more powerful.
For sure. Well, a lot of times people use samples just to get more of an isolated track so they can push up, for example, a kick drum a little louder in the mix without, bringing up all of that ambience and stuff that can kind of surround it.
Totally.
But for the way that you're recording, where you are recording a lot of bands playing live or in tight spaces, how do you go about getting your drums to like poke through when you're not using those samples or when you're not leaning into them so much? Like how are you able to get them to like still come through, but without all of that extra bleed and noise? Or maybe that is part of the charm of it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it is. I try not. Sometimes I have to remind myself that like bleed is a part of drums, and like that I might be hyper focusing on like the amount of hi-hat that's in the snare or something like that. I think when I go too like neurotic on cymbals, like I end up like actually on making the drums more dead than they probably should be. So I mean, a lot of it will come down to mic placement and then microphone choice. I'm fortunate enough to have a pair of the Josephson E22S microphones, and the studio has a pair of 2 as well. So between them, between both of us, we have 4. Those have been amazing for tom miking, not just because of the side addressability to place them, but their off-axis rejection is really natural. So it can be really close to a crash cymbal, and it doesn't sound like tinfoil being scrunched up or anything. So that benefits me a lot later on because I can boost up these like, the shells of the drums and not fight this like kind of bleed that's happening as much. And then same with the snare, I'll use like I can't even remember. I just like, it's the, whatever the more kind of direct 57 is it a beta 58 or something like that? I can't remember.
There's beta 57, there's beta 58.
Might be the beta 57. I'm coming off like I don't do this stuff every day.
You know what it is, and you just choose it. You don't get too worried with the brands or the model number.
Yeah. That's what I'll tell myself. But yeah, like I try and just like get things that are going to be hyper directional on problem areas, like with a snare drum and like getting the like not wanting to get too much hi-hat in and stuff like that. But I found that also if you do a good job of capturing the kit in total, a lot of times I use Cole's 4038s as overheads, and that the pickup pattern of that and the tone is like such a kind of 3-dimensional natural sound that it can glue these things together. And then when you embellish like kick and snare on top of that, it doesn't feel like you're dealing with all these isolated instances. Like it's you kind of, if you get that full picture at first, like embellishing other things seems to like work out pretty well. And having a good drummer makes all the difference too, for sure. If the drummer is just really laying into things, like that's where the majority of the impact comes from. So I'll find myself also reaching for samples if like it's just not being hit in the way that is desired. But if I can find a way to make it sound somewhat natural in the process, I will definitely like do my best to try and do that.
Absolutely. Well, I thought that one of the things, hopefully people picked up on this, but it wasn't so much that you're picking a specific mic just because. It's like you're very, very particular with understanding the pattern and the rejection of these microphones and being very strategic with how you place them. It's not just a matter of picking the mic. It's really understanding the rejection side of things as well. And I think that's huge. That like, when you're actually aware of that stuff, it gives you so much more power to like just get the control you need in the mix and save yourself from having to do a shit ton of gating and stuff like that later on. So yeah, I think it's really important. Yeah. Really important to be mindful of that. And I think a lot of people forget about that part of it. They'll just stick up a mic in front of whatever source and just call it a day, right? But knowing that rejection side of things is going to be very helpful, especially in a live setting.
Totally, yeah. I mean, it's like so much will come from, or you can do so much in that initial point. You just have to be very intentional about it. But you're going to save yourself like swiping like the EQ over all these parts and like really trying to like surgically get rid of stuff. You can just by making a decision in the moment that like saves you so much time later on.
Well, another thing that I was curious to ask about is that when I listen to your tracks that you've worked on, like saturation seems to be a little bit of a theme, and I hear a lot of saturation being used. And I'm curious to know, like, what role does saturation generally play in your production? Like, is that something that you're shooting for in the tracking stage? Is it more a matter of just like the chaos of the room that's making it feel saturated? Like, where does saturation usually fit into your workflow?
The times when I make a decision about it in tracking, usually like, well, I have, not to get too gear focused, but I do have a preamp. It's the Undertone Audio MPDI4, which has a great feature on it where you can pad the outputs of it, and you can drive the preamp and it won't ever clip in Pro Tools. And I will implement that if like I know that the band wants like a sound that's like pushing against the medium in some sort of way. So, but outside of that, I wish I had more access to things that could achieve that in tracking, but it's not really in my like arsenal of equipment to do like harmonic distortions and stuff like that. I don't have a lot of units that do that sort of stuff. So sometimes that will happen in the post department with things like Decapitator and stuff like that. If I just, it's kind of the phenomena of like, this was recorded like clean and now I want to make it seem like it was recorded like on bad equipment kind of thing. Because certain bands, like the records that they listen to and enjoy, were recorded on things like that. Oh, and then also I have a Tascam Porta Studio, a 4-track that has been really useful for achieving like 80s hardcore style like records and stuff like that are predominantly recorded on things like that. There's certain bands where their whole catalog that they've done with me has been on those using that unit. And what I do with that is in my rehearsal room, I have a 24-track console that I'll do like a multi-mic drum setup where like everything is mic'd and processed on the way into that console. And then I'll just like send it out of one group, a mono group, to one channel on the 4-track. So it's this like meticulously captured drum sound, but it's hitting this like cassette recording multi-track machine. And then I can drive it on there. And I find that like that's where I get the most like success with like saturating something in the tracking process. But it requires a lot of back and forth with the band of like, play a little bit of drums. I'm going to record it. We'll listen back to it. Is this the amount of crunch you want on everything? And if you go through that enough and like really hone in on it, then the band is tracking each song and it's essentially done. Like it's going to sound like how it's going to sound when it's mixed essentially at that point. But it's really, it feels great to use tools like that and have them just like do the thing that they do. And then it achieves the sound that the band is looking for instantaneously. It's
For
like
sure.
a nice workflow.
Yeah, it shortcuts that process so you're not having to rely on it later. But I love that you outline that process of like record a little bit, listen back, and like just kind of go back and forth until you feel like you finally got that grit right. Because yeah, it's saturation is one of those things that it's so easy to overdo. And I think a lot of people when they're getting into this, like they tend to play it too safe because they're afraid of either ruining their tracks or it's the complete opposite where they just slam the shit out of everything and then everything's super distorted. So there is that fine line of figuring out where that sweet spot is. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of work, but that's what you got to do to get there, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think with so much, it's just like, it's like the measure twice, cut once kind of thing. Like totally. I think that it applies, especially to any sort of analog format, is like, be annoying about it in the beginning because that's where it's going to matter the most in the whole process. And it might be a little like kind of tedious to do it, but I think it benefits you a lot.
For sure. And another thing you said kind of made me think back to one of the earlier things that we were talking about in our conversation, that idea of like not being aware of like a better way of doing things, or like, you know, being told that this is the only way to do something. And it reminded me of like, you were talking about slamming preamps a little bit more. And, you know, I remember just like in those early days, like learning like, hey, you're never supposed to clip a preamp, you know, and even having like teachers in recording school telling me that too, you know, like always set your preamp so you got lots of headroom. And it's like, no, that's not always the truth, you know? And when you actually see it done where it's like slamming into a pre and it sounds awesome, you're just like, oh, this is cool. I can do this when I need it. So, you know, it's not like there are rules that you always have to adhere to, for sure. Like definitely learn the gear, learn its limitations, learn what happens when you go too hard with it. And that just it becomes a tool in your arsenal.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important sometimes to like look away from the visual cues because those will like govern a lot of your decision making sometimes of like, oh, does this look right? And like, it's obvious, but like, it's worth reminding yourself that like, it's about how it sounds So you should like, if it means don't look at the meter and turn it up until it sounds the way you want it to, then like I think that's important to do sometimes too. Because similar with the preamps thing, I feel like compression, people get in their heads of being like, I shouldn't do more than like 3 or 4 dB and stuff like that. And it's like, I think those safeguards are in place if you're not kind of tuning your ears into what you're hearing. But I think it's good to also sometimes just like disregard what the levels are saying about anything and just turn the knob until it's doing what you want it to. And I think your ears will lead you to the right decision a lot of the time.
For sure. Absolutely. So like, what's your approach typically when it comes to starting a new mix? Like, whether it's something you've done yourself or something someone else has sent you, like what kind of things are you typically listening for in that early listen? And like when it comes to that kind of workflow or game plan that you plan to execute, like what are you normally considering at that stage?
The first thing I just dive into drums initially. Like I'll get everything imported and I'll just mute everything that is in the drums and I'll get them organized in the kind of track flow that I like, which is usually just all the drums sent to 2 aux tracks. One's going to have a compressor on it and one of them is going to be just dry, but 2 stereo auxes with them on it. And then I'll mute the one that I'm going to be compressing and I just start with all the dry ones. And I just go through, I start at like the kick, the snare, I bring the toms in, I get familiar with like what the kind of tonal quality is of everything that I'm going to be working with. And when I get the drums feeling strong and like either embellishing with like samples or like bringing in like plugins for ambience and stuff like that, I just try and get the drums to sound exciting in some sort of way, if that's what the music is calling for, or like, making them sound impactful. And I find that once I like really, I'm like not even paying attention to like the rest of the instruments at all. I'm just kind of like listening to what the drums are setting the tone for the song with. And then once that's good, I bring in like the bass, get the bass worked in there, and then kind of just build it from there. And then any of the other elements and then vocals at the end of it. And I find that through that process, like maintaining like dynamic impact and like all that stuff sets up the song to kind of gel together in the way that works best for it, from what I've like, at least my experience with doing it. And then I mix usually, yeah, pretty much all the time. I mix all in one session. So once I get like one song good, then I import everything else and put them slide them up into the tracks that they're supposed to be in. And that's like helped my workflow a lot, because I think if I like get the general universe figured out on one track, it can be just like processed like that on the rest of them. And it feels cohesive in that way for me. So sometimes I have sessions that are just like obliterating my CPU because I just like, it's like 10 tracks all in one session. But I've never been someone that can like navigate closing that session, opening the other one. And then like if I change, import track settings and stuff like that, I think it's just a lot easier for me to make these like bulk moves across things and then automate changes across the songs. But yeah, that's my general workflow for it.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that. Like, what advantage do you feel like you gain from working multiple songs in one session as opposed to mix a song, close it, bring up a new song, import the session settings from the previous song, and like, working that way. But yeah, I guess if it's just like whatever feels most comfortable and natural to you, then makes sense, right?
Yeah. And I think as much as I do embrace a lot of like fluidity with how I track and stuff like that on a personal level, and I think on like a workflow level for me, I can get really like neurotic about like, especially when I was using more outboard gear to mix, I would like be so meticulous with recall, where I would like take the mix I had initially, and then I would take what I'm doing like in real time when I'm going back to that mix with all my outboard, and I would like do a null, like I would like flip the phase of it, and I would sit there until like the snare was literally phase canceling, because that would tell me that like these settings are exactly the same as they were before. Like that's something I get so meticulous about. So that's like, I think just a benefit for me if it's all in the same session, that it's like I can guarantee that like the drums on this song sound exactly the same as the drums on that song, and it saves me the trouble of having to go in each time. If I like change the snare by like 0.5 decibels on one song, I don't have to go and import track data every time for across a 12 song record. That would just like totally just numb my brain if I had to do that every time.
Fair. How do you ultimately know when you're done with a mix?
I mean, at least done with one in the sense that I'm ready to send it to a band and have them check it out. It's just like when I don't know, I'm turning it up loud in the studio and I'm like moving around and stoked on it and like feel moved by it in some way. When I've addressed every kind of like technical concern with each thing where like are, the vocals compressed and de-essed in the right way, like the more like kind of like smaller like details stuff that isn't like the big grandiose like like drums feeling huge and stuff like that. Have I like taken the noise out of like parts that don't need like guitar buzz and stuff like that? When I've like kind of like dotted my I's and crossed my T's in that area and the mix is feeling impactful, then like that's when I at least send it to the band and be like, I think this is 90% in the ballpark of what they want. And hopefully it's just a matter of kind of tweaking some things. Or I'll present to them too, being like, this is one way we could do this. And then I can list out other ways of like, we could, if you wanted to be more vocal forward, if you wanted the guitars to be showcased more, I can do that as well. But this is where I think it's should be sitting right now. But like, definitely let me know if there's a different vision that you had. So, because I don't want to ever scare a band and send them something and be like, this is what your band sounds like. And I've like missed the mark somehow.
Yeah.
So I try and let them know that it's like, there's like a lot of different ways, especially just getting mixes from or getting tracks from a band that tracked it themselves or something. Like there's a lot of different avenues of representation that we can do with material.
For sure. It all comes back to that communication thing you were talking about earlier. So yeah, that makes sense. How long do you find it typically takes you to complete a mix?
I don't want to out myself too much here because, I'm sure people are like paying for like a day and stuff like that. But I mean, I do put in, I think also people are paying me for the fact that I've been doing this for so long. But there's sometimes like within the hour, like I am like most of the mix is like kind of where it's going to be. And then other stuff is like detailed. If I'm not having to fight a lot of stuff in the way that the tracks were done and everything, if I'm not having to edit or do anything like that, which I usually stray away from for mixing, I think it happens pretty quickly. And I just say that because I want it to be it was an encouraging thing told to me when I was starting out too, where it's like where you get the mix sitting within like the first 30 minutes or something is probably, depending on your process, but like that's probably going to be the bulk of what it is. And I think that saves you from sitting and just like endlessly tweaking things, because I think the major moves are what make are the defining characteristics of the mix. And then the smaller, more granular stuff is like, it can be important for sure, but I don't think it's what's standing between you and greatness or something like that is what you're doing in those like hours of just like methodical kind of adjustments.
For sure. I 100% agree with that. Like, I coach a lot of people when it comes to mixing, and one of the challenges I always get everyone to do is like, make me a 30-minute mix. And everyone always freaks out, like, oh, there's no way. And it's like, you'll be surprised at how much you can get done in a half hour. And like, when you just factor in those big picture things, like that is the bulk of the mix. And if you give someone an extra 5 hours after that, it's marginally better, but the bulk of it came in that first half hour for sure.
Yeah, I think it's good to like be comfortable with that and then not burn yourself out, because you're going to need energy for some things later on for sure. And like automation and things like that can really embellish in a cool way, but you don't want to be like EQing a snare drum for an hour. It just is what it is after a certain point.
Yeah, for sure. Like set a limit for yourself of how long you can EQ everything. You get like 2 moves per track or something like that. Once you start like challenging yourself to like do less and less, you realize just how much more you can accomplish that way, and how much of like the big picture moves, the broad stroke EQs and stuff like that, like that's often all you need. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So in your mind, then at the end of the day, like what ultimately makes a great mix?
I think, and it might be like kind of cliche, but really like the performance is going to be such a defining characteristic of what the mix is and how it resonates with people. So it's hard to say like what, because there's so many mixes that I like, or there's songs that I like that the mixing is not a highlighted feature of it necessarily, but I think because what the song is not being obscured makes a huge difference. So I think from a mixing engineer's perspective, like, are you getting in the way of the song is a good thing to ask yourself. And outside of that, I think if things are coalescing in a way that feels organic or at least appropriate for what the song is going for, what the band is going for. I don't know. I just resonate so much with things that feel, and this is a personal taste of mine, but like, I just like things that feel authentic, and that's the music I gravitate towards. So whenever I feel like a mix might be like slamming and sounding like, like huge or something, but if it's like hard to relate to what is being created by the musicians, and like the human element of it is like totally removed from it, it makes it hard for me to like really enjoy it. So I think, I don't know, it's kind of like an esoteric thing, and it comes down to a lot of like personal preference. But for me, I do favor things that sound very just real, in the sense that I feel like you can feel the presence of like the people creating the music in there. So that's, at least for myself, like I try to like give respect to that sort of presentation of a mix. And but on like a technical level, I just feel like if things are balanced and things aren't like overly tweaked to kind of like oversell something, I think the less sort of just manipulating, probably the better a lot of the time. Because I think a lot of times those manipulations and stuff will come off as like an insecurity about what was recorded, what was presented. And I think you're a lot safer embracing what is there, as opposed to trying to obscure it or turn it into something that it isn't.
That's awesome. I love that answer. I think it's very cool. And I don't think anyone's answered that question on the podcast the way you did. But it really does highlight the importance of that early recording stage, and really just getting things to sound good then, and getting the performance. Because I can think of so many songs that I love that the mix does not sound good. It's not balanced, but like the song is there, the performance is there, the emotion's there. And so, I think you're right. It all has to kind of start from that foundation first. And in a lot of ways, it's like mixing should also be kind of seen, like a lot of people look at mastering engineers, where like a mastering engineer isn't supposed to drastically change the mix. They're just kind of making like slight improvements on it. And I think a mix can be like that for a great performance. It shouldn't have to drastically change things and alter your tones and your amp sounds or whatever. It's like it should just preserve the beauty of the song, the performance, for sure.
Yeah, I am a firm believer that like a great band with music that they are very personally invested in, and that they perform with a lot of conviction, could record just about in any format. And that, I mean, any format aside from like if someone gets in and really like interferes with it, but like they could be up against like less than favorable recording conditions. But if that chemistry is there with the band and they're able to express themselves in the way that is most comfortable for them, I just think that is going to be successful no matter what. And that's a lot of times what I see, is that like a band that writes songs and performs them with a lot of like conviction, that just comes across regardless of the medium a lot of the time. So I try to just like avoid potentially getting in the way of that by doing too much, or just like not even giving them a chance to communicate themselves in the right way that plays to the strengths of what they do.
For sure. I love that. Well, I think that's probably a great spot to start to wrap things up. If people want to learn more about you, maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I do have a website. I haven't updated it in a while, but it's just ryanellery.com. And I have my email on there. Email is the best way to reach me. I have gotten off of social media, which has been great on a mental health perspective, as far as being, I think, available or as reachable for work. Maybe it doesn't benefit me as much, but it's a sacrifice I'm willing to take because my quality of life is a little better not always being on my phone. I do have a recording Instagram page that I don't run. Someone else runs it, but also it never gets updated. So I think just if you want to work with me, this is funny. Ringsrecording@gmail is my email. My nickname used to be Rings when I worked at Panda because I wore 9 rings on my fingers at all times. And there was another intern named Ryan, so I became Rings, and that was like a whole identity for me for a while. But I haven't gone by that name in like almost 10 years. So, but ringsrecording@gmail. Yeah, anyone is welcome to hit me up. And then if you go to ryanellery.com, that has like a good chunk of my catalog. I haven't put the newest stuff on there, but it gives you a good idea of the kind of stuff that I do. And yeah, I'm down to work on anything, like any sort of music, any kind of genre. Like I like achieving people's goals and their vision for what they're trying to do. So if there's anything in that speaks to anybody, they're always welcome to hit me up.
Love that. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's been great to talk to you about all this.
So that was my episode with Ryan Ellery, and I really enjoyed learning more about her journey in this. But also one of the things that really caught my attention was that idea of learning different workflows and how she learned 2 very different styles of working, right? There's the approach of everything being dealt with at an individual performance level where you're tracking everyone separately and you're getting very meticulous with each performance and, maybe playing chunk by chunk, or I've even seen people that do note by note. Some people can get very, very anal with this stuff, right? And so it's interesting to learn that side of things, but then to also go to the complete opposite end where she is now, where a lot of it is live and raw, and it's so far removed from that other side. But I think it is really important to actually learn both sides of the coin so that you can be adaptable. And with everything that she was talking about here, as far as like creating that comfort with artists before they enter the studio and making sure that their performances are exciting because they're excited to be in the studio. All of that has to do with the way that you ultimately track the band. And if you kind of force a certain production technique or approach to an artist, that can very easily get them out of the headspace they need to be in to get those proper performances and to get the energy and the emotion and the feel and all that stuff. So yeah, I love that there's so much flexibility in the way that Ryan works. And it's cool to learn both sides, but also to identify for yourself too, what do you gravitate towards? What kind of music do you gravitate towards? And also another thing is, what does the genre that you're working on necessitate? Because there are definitely times when I'm working with artists that they have over edited everything because they think that that's the way to do it. But then they're working on like a jazz track or something like that. And you're like, this sounds like shit because you've gone way too far correcting things that shouldn't be corrected. That genre needs fluidity. It needs things to just sound human, and mistakes are a good thing, right? And even with a lot of rock-based music too, the same thing can apply. You can have out-of-tune notes. You can have little finger squeaks and stuff like that. All of that can be really cool. That can add to the energy. So just because a lot of people do edit heavily doesn't mean you need to, right? And likewise, there are certain times when you do want to edit everything super tight and cut everything out that is noisy or, any out of tune notes, all that kind of stuff. There is a time and place for both of those approaches, but it's just a matter of understanding what does the genre that you're working in typically do and what does the artist want? What do they want to hear in their music? Do they want to listen back to their songs and think, that doesn't sound like us? Like somebody just completely replaced our performance with samples and tightening up everything way too much, right? So having these lines of communication very early on is super important because you get to really establish all this stuff before you start. And then that lets everyone know where this is going. And there's no surprises in the end or during the middle of the process, right? So yeah, I really appreciate Ryan's approach here to how she works with artists and how flexible she is in her approach to. And yeah, I think that's super important. And if you listen to her work, you'll hear that rawness. You'll hear that every track feels different and that every artist has their own unique sound. I think that that's a really, really cool thing. And that unfortunately, a lot of producers tend to kind of add too much of their flavor into a sound. So yeah, I think when you listen to the work that Ryan's done, you really appreciate how much that flexibility and all of these conversations that she's had with artists really comes together to make something really cool and unique. So yeah, definitely check out her work online. And with that said, as we talked about in this episode, sometimes learning these two different approaches, the extreme way to do it and the loose way to do it, a lot of times there's little steps in each of those that most people haven't experimented with before. They don't know what's possible, right? And as Ryan said, like even something as little as when to use audio suite plugins versus using a send and return or an insert, all of that kind of stuff can be really eye-opening, and it can ultimately shape into your personal production workflow. And so if you feel like there's a lot that you just don't know when it comes to production, if you feel like you're maybe slow or inefficient in the way that you work, or you don't know what to be listening for, or how to be dialing in the best settings, or even maybe you don't have a workflow at all that you're following and you're just kind of guessing every single time you work. If you want help with that, I would absolutely love to help you. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that's exactly what I do. And I'm really big on teaching the decision-making process so that you can go to either extreme depending on what your music needs and where you see your music going. And one of the first things that I always work on with my students is establishing what the end goal is. What do they want their music to sound like? What are the artists that they look up to? And what do those recordings sound like? Because once we can establish that, then we have a clear path for knowing how much editing we're going to do, what kind of recording techniques we're going to be implementing, maybe mic choices, mix moves, effects, all that kind of stuff. So if you want help with that, if you want someone that can teach you a workflow and help you with that decision-making process and ultimately getting your vision to come to life, I would love to work with you. And if you visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, you can currently book a free call with me. I'd love to hop on a call to learn more about your music and what's working for you, what's not working for you, where you're feeling stuck, and to see if I can ultimately help you. My goal with these calls is to help you establish the next steps for yourself and to know where to be focusing your energy. And if it looks like I can help you, then we can talk about working together. But it's a no pressure call, really just designed to help you get clarity on where you're at with your music and how you can see the fastest improvements. So once again, if you're interested, make sure to check out masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. So thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.